So tonight I'm going to tell you folks a little bit about California's Confederate sister cities, which are Mariposa and El Monte. Now, Mariposa is it's the gateway to Yosemite. It's the county up in the Sierra Nevadas that has Yosemite. This was discovered by Anglo-Americans in the 1851 Yosemite Indian War. Very sad story, very sad facts, but that's how Anglo-America came into possession of that resource that became a state park and later a national park. So on the left, you see a photo of Yosemite Valley from the 1860s. And on the right, you see a photo of folks hanging out at the El Monte Hotel in El Monte, California, down here in Los Angeles County. When a lot of people think of El Monte today, they think of lowriders and oldies, but the ethnic and cultural makeup that was prevalent in El Monte was very different in the 1860s. Yes, there were a lot of Hispanics in the area, but political control as far as the American system and the new California state government rested almost entirely with Democrats in that particular town. And even Los Angeles had a heavy Democratic presence. And during the war between the states, a lot of folks forget, a lot of people had been here in California for over a decade, but they were still transplants. There were almost no native Californians who were not Hispanic at that particular time. But this particular story begins a couple of years before the Civil War with a state militia company called the Mariposa Mounted Riflemen. They were founded in January and February of 1858 in anticipation of deployment to Utah. For those who might not remember, there was the Cold War going on in the Utah territory between the federal government on one side and the Latter-day Saints Church on the other side. They had gone out to Utah before that area was actually part of the United States. They went west of the Louisiana Purchase, and then the U.S. border crossed them, and they were not happy about that. And then the Mountain Meadows massacre happened, and there was a lot of outrage in California. And to this day, the UC historians and the BYU historians don't agree. But the point is, that's where this militia company was created. However, they never got deployed, but they just kept drilling. The elected captain of this company was a native Virginian by the name of Benjamin Butler Harris. He came to Mariposa in the early 1850s. He blazed a trail across southern Arizona, for which he had a lot of great renown. He was deeply respected in his community, tried his hand at mining, but really he was successful as a lawyer. And then there was another gentleman who was a founding member of this militia company. His name was James Lawrence. He was a native New Yorker, but he was a Democrat by the time the Civil War started. So he sympathized heavily with the secessionists. Now, the makeup of politics and the Democratic Party changed very dramatically in California during the sectional crisis. California was a quote-unquote free state, but what does that mean? According to the laws at that time, a free state was a state where residents could not legally own or possess slaves in that state. So with the fugitive slave law, which made a lot of concession to slaveholders, one way that a lot of people got around that is they did have their slaves with them in California when they went for business trips or whatever it was. And as long as they did not stay the full year to get residency in California, they would go back to Mississippi, hang out there for 2 months, and then go back to California with their slaves and hang out there for 10 months. Now, in Northern California, pro-union Democrats or anti-slavery Democrats were in power in more places. Now, when we say anti-slavery Democrats, that does not mean that they were anti-slavery. It means they were against the expansion of slavery into new territories, or at least they supported the Stephen Douglas line, which was popular sovereignty. Let that state or territory's voters decide. But there was this faction some of you folks know about called the Chivalry, which was the Lecompton Democrats, the Southern Democrats. They were pro-slavery, and they were in favor of the pro-slavery paramilitary groups during Bleeding Kansas. So one of the ways that the Chivalry Democrats concoct a scheme to get more political power is they team up with a lot of the politically disenfranchised ethnic Mexicans of Southern California. Southern California was very sparsely populated compared to the San Francisco Bay. They called them the cow counties, and before the Mexican War, the adult population of California was maybe 2,000. After the gold rush, it was about 100,000, and 98% of them were Anglo-Americans. So the Californios, they lost almost everything, especially their political power. if they made this deal with the chivalry, which was kind of a deal with the devil, then they would at least be able to control, a big chunk of the state government. So they passed the PICO Act in the California state legislature, which divided the northern part of California into a free state and the southern California into the slave state of Colorado. This did pass the legislature, but it was never enacted and it was never kicked up to Congress because it was interrupted by the sectional crisis. On the right, you see a map from the 1860 presidential election. And right here, this little green county below the bend in California, that's Mariposa. And this county went for John C. Breckinridge. They were Southern Democrats. Los Angeles went for Stephen Douglas, but it had its pro-secession parts. And then San Bernardino, which we're going to see some of in a moment, it narrowly went for Lincoln, but that's only because the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats were at each other's throats. Even going for Lincoln in that same election, the county elected a Northern Democrat to the state assembly. So the Democrats, I think, still control the area. They just had different loyalties. Now the secession crisis comes, and this affects a lot of people in Mariposa County. First, Captain Butler of the Mariposa Mounted Riflemen, being a Virginian, resigns his commission in the California State Militia. He knows he's going to go back to the South. He just doesn't know how or when. The very next month, California State Assembly has its final session, and the Assembly passes a resolution against seceding from the Union. They were pro-Union. However, one of the guys who voted against staying in the Union was Mariposa County's assemblyman, a man by the name of Dan Showalter. Made his name as a gold miner in the county, was very deeply respected. They elected him to office. Even though he was born and raised in Pennsylvania, he was a Confederate sympathizer. And after the end of the session, he challenged a pro-Union Democrat, Charles Piercy, who was San Bernardino's assemblyman, to a duel. Showalter won. And what happens next? Around the time that Showalter is having his duel with Charles Piercy over whether California should secede from the Union or not, a state militia company from Los Angeles, they took off. They got mustered into the state militia, they got issued their weapons, and then they went off to join the Confederacy. You see a picture of two gentlemen here. The guy with the big old Grizzly Adams beard, that's Alonzo Ridley. He was the undersheriff of Los Angeles, and he was very strongly pro-Confederate. He was elected the company commander of the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles. A lot of their recruits were from El Monte, which, as I said, was Southern California's Confederate capital. And this here is a very dramatic artist rendering of Albert Sidney Johnston and the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles crossing the Mojave Desert. So that was their big claim to fame. This militia company got Albert Sidney Johnston and Louis Armistead from California safely to Confederate territory. But a lot of the recruits were from El Monte. And now there's three photos here. On the left is Benjamin Harris, who was the former commander of the Mariposa Mounted Riflemen. He disappears from Mariposa County late in 1861. He hung around for about 5 months after he resigned his commission. And then, according to my research, as I saw, in the middle of September 1861, his advertisements for his law firm stop appearing in the Mariposa Gazette. And then he disappears for about a year. He pops up again back in Virginia, but then he was transferred to the Texas troops because during his southwestern trip across Arizona, he learned Spanish. This right here is James Lawrence, who was one of the founding members of the Mariposa Mounted Riflemen. And this is a outdated photo of Assemblyman Dan Showalter from the 1850s. All three of these men were Mariposa men who, at the beginning of 1861, supported the Confederacy. Now, Holcomb Valley is the next part of our story. It is the valley in the San Bernardino Mountains that's immediately north of Big Bear Valley. It's the other side of the ridge. If any of you were ever involved in scouting, there's a big old Boy Scout camp there. This was the site where a gentleman named Bill Holcomb discovered the biggest gold vein in the history of San Bernardino County. So overnight between 1860 and 1861, there's a boomtown in Holcomb Valley with over 1,500 people, and a lot of them were Southern sympathizers, to the point where the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was a pro-Confederate secret society, they really liked imitating Masonic rituals, but they were very political and very pro-Confederacy, pro-slavery. They had rat lines by which they were sneaking people from Northern California, from the mining camps in the Sierras, down to the San Bernardino Mountains, and then from San Bernardino they would either go to El Monte or they would immediately go into San Diego County to Temecula. And if they dared make the journey, they would cut across Arizona County, New Mexico to try to get to Texas, or they would go to Mexico and take the old overland stage route. But up in Holcomb Valley, there were so many members of the Knights of the Golden Circle and so many pro-Confederate Southerners from around the state congregated there at one time that they were actually giving each other militia training. So several times the San Bernardino Rangers, which was the local militia, and the Federal Army had to go send patrols to make people scatter, to break up these paramilitary camps. But throughout 1861 and early 1862, Holcomb Valley was a stopping point for people trying to hide on their way to escape back to Texas. So Ben Harris stopped there on his own, on his way down from Mariposa, and then in a separate trip, Assemblyman Dan Showalter and then James Lawrence, former member of the Mariposa Mounted Riflemen, they also stopped there. Ben Harris made it to Texas eventually, whereas the men of the Dan Showalter Party, they were actually captured by the Federals, and they weren't Federal regulars, they were a mounted patrol from the 1st California Infantry. So this was the California Volunteers that captured these California Confederates while they were a little bit southeast of Temecula. When I say that Mariposa and El Monte were Confederate sister cities, of the 19 people traveling in the Showalter Party, 10 of them came from Mariposa, and then 5 of them joined the party at El Monte. So they were captured, imprisoned. James Lawrence was broken by his experience being captured and imprisoned. He didn't even make it to the Confederate Army. So after he's released from Fort Yuma, he's going to go back to Mariposa County and spend the rest of the war up there. But Showalter was radicalized. He made a second attempt. This time he went down to Mexico, and that time he made it to Texas. And when he got to Texas, he was commissioned an officer in the Arizona Brigade, specifically the 4th Texas Cavalry Regiment of the Arizona Brigade, aka the 4th Texas Arizona. And because of the secessionist activities that were happening in Mariposa and San Bernardino in the mountains and in El Monte, all 3 of those areas were patrolled on a regular basis by the Federal Army for the rest of the war. And I was curious as to whether there was a connection between Bill Holcomb himself and some of these Confederates. Well, in this photo at the far left, you've got Bill Holcomb himself, and at the far right, you've got Benjamin Harris, the ex-Confederate from Mariposa. So there's a good chance that these guys knew each other before or during the war, before Ben Harris went back to California in the 1870s. And that is the end of the very abbreviated version of our story. If you want more Civil War stories that take place specifically in California and the Southwest, you can check out my YouTube channel, the Civil War Wild West Edition. And I will be very pleased to be giving a presentation to the Roundtables in March, on March 14th. Mike Hoover invited me, and I was absolutely starving to take up that opportunity. So I'm excited about that. And I'm happy to share this PowerPoint if you guys want the references and the photos. So that is the story of the sister cities of Mariposa and El Monte.
Well, thank you very much, Jack, for sharing that. One quick comment on there for that. The opening slide that you had a picture of Yosemite Valley from the 1860s. I can tell you that almost certainly that photograph was not taken in the 1860s, probably later. And the reason I'm saying that is that it heavily featured a number of clouds, which from a photography standpoint wasn't really possible. It's very, very rare to be able to see clouds. And so that it's likely that that picture had to have been taken later. It still looks like an early photo, but just not from specifically the 1860s, just from a technology standpoint. So
it is entirely possible that the photo was taken later. I just went with the date that the CHS put in the file number.
I certainly understand that. I just was throwing that in because it was like, oh, wait a minute. You don't see, if you look at Civil War photos that are taken outdoors, you just don't see clouds in there for that reason. And so just comment on there for that. All right. So